This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We're on the road in Tampa, Florida. We're broadcasting from the PBS station WEDU. I'm joined now by three guests to talk about the state of the media here in Florida. Patrick Manteiga is with us. He's editor and publisher of Gaceta Newspaper, one of the oldest minority-owned newspapers in the United States, also the country's only trilingual newspaper, publishing in English, in Spanish, and in Italian. We're also joined by Marty Petty. She is executive vice president and publisher of the St. Petersburg Times, Florida's largest newspaper. It's owned by a nonprofit corporation, a model that is gaining increasing attention amidst the current state of closures and cutbacks at the nation's newspapers. And I'm co-hosting this segment today with Rob Lorei, the managing editor of Florida This Week here on WEDU, the PBS station here in Tampa. And he is a co-founder of WMNF Radio, where he serves as the news and public affairs director. He's covered West Central Florida politics for more than 20 years. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Well, it's great to have you with us. So, Rob, why don't you begin?
Well, let's start. Amy, there was just an article in The Nation magazine that suggested that, it was written by John Nichols and Robert McChesney, and it suggested that it's possible to contemplate a time in the near future when major towns will no longer have a newspaper and when magazines and network news operations will no longer employ more than a handful of reporters. So the question becomes, Nichols and McChesney asked the question, should we consider a nonprofit model for newspapers around the country as a way to get out of this mess that we're in? Marty, I got to ask you, how long ago, the St. Pete Times is owned by a nonprofit, how long ago did that arrangement take place?
Well, Nelson Pointer he was quite a visionary, way ahead of his time, and as owner of the newspaper, he envisioned that there could be a time when it would be important for a newspaper to remain independent on behalf of its community and the citizens that it served. And so upon his death in '78, the newspaper and 100% of its stock was given to a school that he had created, the Poynter Institute for Media Studies, at that time called the Modern Media Institute, which is a school for journalists, a nonprofit school. And he gave 100% of the stock, the newspaper, to the school.
Has the St. Pete Times, under that arrangement, being owned by a nonprofit, do you still pay taxes?
We are a for-profit company. We do pay taxes, and then from our profits, a dividend goes to the school.
Now, how have you weathered this recession and the downsizing of most major newspapers in the country?
We believe we have done quite well. Certainly, we have the same challenges as everybody around us. Our advertisers are under tremendous strain, as you can see, across the country. Automotive, retail, all started by the real estate problems that we all know so well. But we have the flexibility to take a long-term view. And we believe in newspapers. We believe that when the economy comes back, newspapers will continue to be effective, efficient marketing vehicles for advertisers. We worked quite well delivering fabulous audiences before this recession hit, and that will happen again.
So a lot of papers are cutting back their Washington, D.C. bureaus, their state capitol bureaus, their investigative reporting. Do you still have you maintained all those?
We have. Our news organization is slightly smaller than it was a couple of years ago. But we still have staff covering, based in Washington, covering Florida and its affairs, and we still have quite a healthy bureau in Tallahassee. We have recently combined our efforts with Miami Herald, which is a very unusual thing. We have been, our journalists have competed for years.
Structurally, though, the difference between you and a chain-owned paper is that you don't have to send your profits back to an out-of-town owner, right?
That is correct. Our profits stay in the community. We are able then to invest back into our news and our journalism, which we believe is very important, into our marketing. I think it serves the community. We are institutions of democracy. I think it has proven to serve the community very, very well.
How does your nonprofit fit in with this proposal by the Democratic Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland, right, introducing a measure aimed at rescuing the newspaper industry, the Newspaper Revitalization Act that would let newspaper companies become educational nonprofits and operate similar to, well, as we do, at public radio and public television.
First of all, I'm not an expert on the legislation, but I think there are a lot of questions around what that really looks like. I think nonprofits have restrictions. For example, you are not permitted to endorse political candidates. And that raises a kind of interesting question if you think about some of the traditional roles that newspapers have played in their communities. I think a lot of these models are going to be explored, and we're at the very beginning of that. There's questions around a nonprofit model per se versus a tax-exempt model.
I mean, key for broadcasters, public broadcasters, is that listeners, viewers, and in your case, readers, can give tax-deductible contributions.
Right. It's not quite as simple, though, as that. I think folks who really understand, I'm not, a legal expert on this, but how it has been structured between the Poynter Institute being a school and the news entity, in effect, being a nonprofit, are two different concepts that I think have to be more clearly understood.
One of the problems that you would face if we were to turn newspapers into nonprofits is that they would no longer, if they were purely nonprofit, they would no longer be able to endorse candidates in elections or recommend ballot issues or that sort of thing because they would violate their tax-exempt status.
That's correct.
Yeah, so that'd be a problem.
Patrick Manteiga, talk about La Gaceta.
La Gaceta's been in my family since 1922. My grandfather started it back then. We would start off as a Spanish daily. Over the years, we've added English and Italian as our community has grown and changed the languages that it depends on. And La Gaceta last year actually had the best year ever in our history. We were a niche market, but when the economy got bad, that meant that foreclosures went up, and we happened to have some foreclosure lawyers who were our clients at the time, and every foreclosure has to have a legal ad that runs with it. So as grocery stores and banks fell down the tube as far as clients were concerned, our foreclosure notices went up to such an extent that it actually made us gave us our most profitability ever.
Spanish, Italian, and English?
Correct.
Why Italian?
There was a large Italian colony that came to Tampa, and they wanted something to help preserve their language and their culture. So back in the 50s, we decided to do just a page of Italian to give them something to read on a weekly basis to help them and their family keep that part of their heritage.
Your newspaper is one of the oldest minority-owned newspapers in the country. Your family from Cuba?
Yes.
Talk about the Cuban community, the changing Cuban community here in Florida.
When two Cubans meet on the street, they have to kind of determine what year their family came over in order to know how the conversation goes. A lot of people feel that, Miami Cuban exile community is the only Hispanic group in the state of Florida, and it's not true. Even amongst Cubans, it's not true. Tampa Cubans generally got here earlier and did not come over for Castro, did not come over because of the Castro takeover. So they tend to be Democratic, vote Democrat. They tend to be a little more liberal on the Cuba issue. Then you have the exile community, the people who came over around 1960. They're generally Republican and a lot more conservative. Then you have the people who came over, the Cubans who came over in the last 10, 15 years. A lot of these people don't vote, but if they were to vote, they would lean with whatever candidate would allow trade and travel to Cuba because they have family there and they are very passionate about it. But our Hispanic community in the state of Florida very soon is going to become dominated by Puerto Ricans, and I think that's a story that a lot of people miss and that the politicians need to keep an eye on. Florida is certainly a pivotal state in our national elections. And a lot of politicians come down here and try and target that Cuban exile community, and they're missing out on the fact that Puerto Ricans have taken over the middle of the state, especially around Orlando, and that is going to be the future vote that's going to tip Florida one way or the other.
Patrick, the third rail in Florida politics has long been lifting the Cuba embargo, and that whether you're a Democrat or Republican in Florida, you could not advocate lifting the Cuban embargo. What's the status of that third rail now? Is that changing? Could a politician win statewide office, or could Barack Obama win a second term with the help